Hello, everybody, and welcome to Ice Time. We dive into the big ideas around the NHL. I'm Mike Fink, and I'm joined by Justin Giampietro, who covers the NHL, Flyers, prospects, just a whole bunch of things. Really big into prospects this year. So the question I probably should ask Justin is who he thinks the Boston Bruins are taking with the sixth pick in the draft. But I'm not going to dive into that at all right now. But Justin, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. It's kind of, well, almost that time of year where hockey regular season almost over, kind of that prospect time around there. So it's exciting time of year. I look forward to it much more than honestly the hockey season just because, well, for me specifically, because the Flyers are always bad and I'm a Flyers fan. So it's a nice escape from the NHL for sure.
I think it's funny because I'm trying to think now when is the best I mean, my opinion is the best time of the year is June or May playoff hockey where you get all that action, playoff hockey, the deeper rounds of the playoffs, and then right after that you quickly get into the draft and then you go on your merry way for the offseason. But that's a good question is when is the best time of the year hockey wise because a lot of people like the midwinter World Junior Prospect sort of series as well, those type of things. But I digress on that. But I brought you on because this actually is a good time to check in on the rebuilds or check in on rebuilding teams. I always do the rebuild rankings. I usually do one this time of year and the off season. I'm actually going to do one in the off season, but where I rank all the rebuilding teams. And this is a good time to just get a good landscape of what are the rebuilding teams this time around, which ones are doing better than others, and just some notes on rebuilding teams and successful rebuilds. And I'm mentioning the word rebuild a lot, which is funny because NHL teams do not like mentioning the word rebuild a lot. It is the taboo word where someone says, "Oh, they're rebuilding." Everyone's like, "No, they're not. They're retooling. They're rebooting, renovating, whatever word they want to use instead." So I'll start with this and ask you what is the line? At what point do you say this team is no longer, as much as they say they're not rebuilding, they are rebuilding? At what point do they cross over that line and you can say, okay, this is a rebuild?
Well, I think it starts with when you start selling your veterans that you don't necessarily have to. A good example, I think, is Calgary this year. They didn't have to trade Uyghur, and they did. And the return, it was okay. They got 3 seconds and a prospect. Like, it wasn't great, and people were expecting more. And I would think that if you are retooling, you look at that package and be like, we're going to keep him. And Kadri, they sold him as well. They didn't have to do these things. These are players with term on their contracts, but they sold. And that kind of signals to me that you don't expect to be good next year, and thus you're rebuilding. I think retooling teams want to give themselves a shot. They don't really want to commit to anything. Um, so yeah, that's how I see it. And there aren't a lot of teams that want to commit to a rebuild. There are a select few, maybe three or four, but those teams, I think they end up doing well for themselves. So, I mean, we'll see with Calgary what happens with them, but
That's the interesting thing because I think there's a fine line. Some people measure rebuild versus retool in timeline, where, all right, we sold off a few pieces at the trade deadline, but we're coming back next year. That's a 1 year or 2 year sort of retool where you retool on the fly, quite literally retooling on the fly. As you trade at the deadline or at the draft, come back, and then you're back, you're a playoff team again. And a rebuild, people say, okay, it's a 3 year or 4 year plan where you're drafting and developing, you're starting from scratch there. And I agree to a point, and I'll add to that what you said is the rebuilding teams. It's once you start taking away core players from that team, the building blocks of your team, you start trading those players. That's really when you enter a rebuild. I think back to the Flames, they a few years back, you could actually look back and say that's when they started rebuilding because you trade Tyler to Foley. Okay, they did that. That's a retool trade where you trade a player who's not your core player. He's a good player on the roster. You traded him to the Devils. You get back young players who are ready to add to the roster right away. One of the players, Igor Sharangovich. So you're adding players that help you right away. Rebuild is you trade Elias Lindholm, which they did also. So, and then they traded their entire defensive unit: Chris Tanev, Nikita Zadorov, Noah Hannafin, and now Rasmus Anderson. So anyway, that's an overhaul where you're really rebuilding there. That's the kind of the line there. And it's interesting because when you look at the NHL now, there's some teams that you could say are rebuilding or have been rebuilding that are in playoff spots. It's a little weird. That's why it's hard to kind of evaluate the teams now, because some of these teams that are rebuilding are probably could be in the playoffs by the end of the season. But I'll ask you this: where you have 32 teams in the NHL, 16 are going to make the playoffs. If I were to say between the 16 that don't, or give or take, what's your ballpark estimate of how many teams you'd say are really rebuilding? How many of them are kind of retooling? And then any other notes. But what's the estimate between the 16 teams that you'd say are rebuilding versus retooling?
It's kind of hard, especially since the summer has not happened yet. So we could kind of see teams like, for example, the Rangers. They've called it a retool, and I think they might have to do a little bit more to call it a rebuild, but we don't know right now. And there are a lot of teams like that. Maybe Vancouver um, could fall in that retooling area, even though they are pretty bad, and there's really not much that I could see getting better for them. Maybe they do, try to win a few more games next year, be more respectable, because that's kind of what some Canadian teams like to do, some of your bigger market teams like to do. They don't like to truly bottom out. So it's hard to estimate just off the top of my head. Maybe three or four teams are truly rebuilding. Um, it's usually not a lot. Most teams like to go the retooling route.
What's funny about that is you mentioned the Rangers, you mentioned the Canucks, and I think they're from when we're measuring a rebuilding team, they fit into that category. You look at the Rangers, you trade Panarin, that signals you're rebuilding. I know they didn't trade Adam Fox or they didn't trade Igor Shesterkin. Okay, so they didn't go as extreme, or they didn't trade Trocheck or all those players, but you trade Panarin, that's kind of signaling as much as you want to say you're retooling. That signals more of a rebuild. You look at the Canucks, you trade Quinn Hughes, it kind of says you're rebuilding there. And then they traded Connor Garland, Kiefer Sherwood. I know they didn't trade Pedersen, they didn't trade Brock Besser, so then go all the way. And I guess that's more of the line between rebuilding and tearing it down. I would I would lean more towards like 8-8 or 10. You could even say there are 10 teams that fit into a rebuild category. And then there are the rest, the six that you could say, okay, maybe they're in the retool category. Because there are teams that have retooled recently. And I think some teams that are heading into the offseason, they're going to say, they're going to see what the Bruins did. They're going to see what the Islanders did. And they're going to say, all right, we could retool on the fly. That's what the Bruins did last offseason, or at the trade deadline. You trade Marchand, Carlo, all those players, and all of a sudden you're back in a playoff mix. But I think that numbers. It's funny because as much as the teams like to say we are not rebuilding, they fall into the category. I think the Maple Leafs are going to be the interesting one. We might dive into them a bit more, where they didn't trade a core player yet, so maybe they are retooling, but they're in that interesting spot. Maybe they, if you do trade a core player next, then all of a sudden you are in that rebuild conversation. Or you could say moving Marner was a signal that yeah, that is a way to rebuild. I'm shifting gears a bit. Look at the teams that have had successful rebuilds recently, and I think you could look at a few that have really actually made it or close to it. Where the Canadians, they're a team that actually have had a successful rebuild. They're in the playoffs right now, and they made it last year, and they're a team that's built to contend for the future now. Where they did a rebuild, and that has been a success. The Blue Jackets are close. They're another team that I guess you could put into that category. The Ducks are also in that same sort of category. Those are like the big three, I think. The jury's still out on. I know people will say the Sharks have had a successful rebuild. I think the jury's out on them, one, because they're not in the playoffs, and two, if it weren't for Celebrini, this wouldn't be a successful rebuild. Pretty much like he's carrying them. So I want to take them out of the bell curve for a second. But when you look at those three teams, or you look at the teams that have had successful rebuilds in general, what do you think are some common themes with some of the teams that I mentioned, or any of them?
Well, I think that first of all, they commit. You look at a team like I like San Jose. I know they're not. The jury's still out on whether they'll make the playoffs or not, but they really committed. They were committed to not being good for a few seasons. I believe they won 39 games in total between two seasons, 22, 23, and 23, 24, or maybe it was 2024 and 2025, those two seasons. But either way, they were losing a lot of games. They were very, very bad. And they accumulated a lot of talent. And look at them now. It's almost funny. You compare a team like the Sharks to, and I hate to bring the Flyers into it because not everything's about them, but It's like they've been bad for the same amount of time. Yeah, one team was really committed to a rebuild, one team really isn't, and now the Sharks are ahead, right? So you look at a team like the Sharks and Montreal as well, and a team like Anaheim. They were bad for a little bit, but they're already back, right? They are probably the team that's going to win the Pacific at this point when you're looking at it. So yeah, you got to commit to it truly if you want your rebuild to be successful.
I think it's interesting you mentioned the Flyers, the Canadians. You mentioned all these teams, and I think what's interesting is a lot of people will say the Flyers don't want to go through a full rebuild because, and then you could draw this back to what Toronto's saying right now. As you could say, all right, it's easy for the Sharks to do this because they're in a small market and they did the tear down, but it's a small market, nobody cares. So a few things on that, which is big markets can do this too. Montreal did it. I think it's interesting is people always say, oh, the Flyers can't do this because in Philly, they can't go through all these years of losing, which they already have. So, okay, why? Well, how much worse? What's the difference? I mean, I guess the difference between finishing 10th in the Eastern Conference and 15th is actually the difference between the seventh pick in the draft and the second pick in the draft, which actually is a little bit of a difference. So you might want the second pick. But anyway, I digress on that. But big teams, big markets have done it. I know the downside to that is you have this frustrated fan base that is that gets really annoyed in a big market. Yeah, they'll sell tickets, but the pressure on the team to be good right away and to turn it around quickly, it's there. And Montreal had to deal with that pressure, and they had to take their medicine where they had those losing seasons after losing seasons, but they stuck to it and they did the rebuild. And the other interesting thing is a lot of big market teams or big market fan bases say you can't rebuild. Small markets have it easier because there's less pressure. There's okay, they don't sell tickets during it, but they can kind of get away with it to an extent. There's a little bit of that. And I would say, well, the downside to them is you the fallout could be losing your team. You look at the Coyotes, and it's if you're really bad in a small market and you do not sell tickets, there is a chance that that team is not there in a few years. Coyotes moving out. I think back in the day, the Winnipeg Jets, they moved. I mean, although I think they were actually better, but the Atlanta Thrashers are a good example. That's actually a good example where they had a lot of losing seasons. And if you rebuild there, you're relocating. So it just the bottom line is any team can do it. You're going to have to take your heat. You're going to have to face your consequences. But again, if you stick to the plan, it works out. One thing I'll throw at you, and I think this is what is interesting, is I think the more I've looked into rebuilds, so the more I focus on them, having a good core, and not just a good core, but a great core, having those 4 or 5 star players to build around matters more than pretty much anything else, or having those players that you could build around. However, you can get them, whether it's developing them, because I think with the Blue Jackets, for example, I don't think Zach Werenski was a top 5 pick. He might have been, but he actually had to develop into a top defenseman. It took some time. Now that he's there, the Blue Jackets are that type of team. Lane Hudson for the Montreal Canadiens, a good example. Having those core players matters. I just want to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, for sure. I think Anaheim is a good example where this year they're really leaning into their young players and they're playing to their strengths. And look what has happened. I get the West is particularly weak this year, specifically the Pacific Division is just a nightmare, but I mean, they've been the best team in it. They're leaning into Leo Carlson and Carter Gauthier and Beckett Seneca and those types of players, and they're very good. They're letting their young guys do what they do best, lead their team, and we're seeing the importance of it. And, as the years go on, they're only going to get better because these guys are very young. Um, I mean, I think Gauthier's oldest at 22. That's very young. He's probably not even in his prime yet. So the future's bright there. And to have as many guys as they do, I didn't even mention Lacombe. It's gonna be a good next maybe decade in Anaheim.
I think something to add to this, something I slipped my mind or I forgot about it is when you have these star players, these young star players, people say, okay, well, they don't have depth. It's easier to add depth when you have those stars. Simply put, players want to play with Macklin Celebrini or with Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl and the Oilers. The Oilers have had not had depth for years, but it's easier to get a player to move their no trade clause to go to play with those players. It makes things, it saves you a lot of headaches. What's something you think you've learned about rebuilds, or what do you think something you've noticed that makes a difference that you probably wouldn't have a few years ago?
I'm going to stick with Anaheim. What was interesting to me, looking back on it now, was their Trevor Zegras trade. Now, I don't think it was particularly great, but I think they got a very important piece in Ryan Paling. That is a great third line center for a rebuilding team. That is the depth you need. And by selling the crazy assets that they've accumulated during this rebuild, a guy like Trevor Zegras that they didn't have as much use for, they're getting depth. And that's the type of depth that, maybe can win you playoff series in the future. So even once you get your stars, you can even sell off the excess that you have and build a really good hockey team around those stars.
I think the talking about selling off excess players, I think that's an interesting point that when you're rebuilding, at some point, all these teams will have prospects on draft first. It starts with draft picks on top of draft picks, where you have like three first rounders, and then you have four second rounders, or whatever it is. Then you end up having prospects on top of prospects. You have to know who your core players are and who aren't. And the ones who aren't, you have to figure out how to take advantage of moving them out or trading them. The Sabres, the knock on the Sabres for years is that their farm system had prospects on top of prospects, and they couldn't find a way to get them onto the NHL team. Someone like Jack Quinn, for example, or Consta Hellenius, who's there now, who's he's in the middle where it's like he's on the AHL team, on the NHL team, but they couldn't find them ways onto the roster. They actually traded away Itzhak Rosean, who's an example of a prospect who they never found a way to move, but finally they move him, and you're getting players on your roster. The Montreal Canadiens did this for years, and where they traded Alexander Romanov or Jonathan Kovacevic, these young defensemen. But okay, well, they knew if Lane Hudson's coming onto the roster, there's not really a spot for those other young defensemen who are good, but not necessarily the core players. And I think that's an interesting point is that, yeah, you're rounding out your roster. You have to find out who your stars are and who aren't, or who your key players for the future are and aren't. And the ones that aren't, you have to move. I want to throw something out there because everyone talks about the head coach or you need a great head coach or you need a great GM in place. I think about like, the team like Pittsburgh, for example, and I think part of the thing we don't talk about enough is what your coaching staff looks like. Because Dan Muse is doing a great job, and I think Dan Muse of Pittsburgh, that's a good example of a team that's overachieved, and you could say they rebuilt on the fly because they really looked like a rebuilding team, or they retooled, but without moving on from Crosby or Malkin or whatever, but or who their core veteran players, but all of a sudden they're in the playoffs. And Dan Muse gets a lot of credit, but you have to when you look at them, they hire Nick Bonino, for example, who's one of those people who was younger, connect to the players, but then you bring in someone like Todd Nelson, who's been a great AHL head coach for years. He's been one of those people that just knows the game really well. And you bring in all these players, you bring in all these coaches that just give you a good group to work with. And it's actually something like if I were an owner, which I'm not and probably will never be because good luck getting all that money. But anyway, if I were owning a team and I were trying to hire a GM or a coach, one of the questions I would ask is, what is your coaching? Who are you bringing in as your assistants? What is this coaching staff going to look like if I hire you? Because everyone looks at the head coach. And I think you look at a team like Pittsburgh, for example, why are they doing so well? And part of that is that they have this infrastructure in place that now all of a sudden it's a team that can overachieve. Just get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, coaching is very important, as I've learned. Um, your coaching staff is kind of an extension of the GM. You have to agree on things, right? It's impossible for you to be successful and the GM and the coaching staff to just fundamentally disagree on things. So you need that in place. Um, I keep going back to Anaheim, but they have a coaching staff in place that is willing to unlock their young players, even though, a guy like Seneca, he takes a lot of risks, and coaches, for the most part, probably don't like that. But he's been allowed to take those risks and be the player who he is because the coaching staff is allowing him to, and it is doing them well. If you were to restrict him, I mean, this season could probably wouldn't be going as well. And then your future probably wouldn't be going as well. I mean, if he's, constantly benched or whatever for his play style, some coaches would. And having that would just be, they would be a nightmare. But they are playing into all the talent they have drafted, and it is working well for them. So you need coaching staff and GM to be on the same page for sure.
And with the Ducks particularly, I mean, Pat Verbeek has not had a great run. Actually, you look at some of the trades he's made or some of the moves he was making. You bring in Quenneville, and everything clicks. I think they also have Jay Woodcroft on their bench. They also have a good. They're a team that has a good staff in place. Where yes, Quenneville's one of the older coaches, but first of all, he doesn't have that sort of retread reputation or have that sort of this is my way of doing things. I'm stuck in my ways, and I'm not changing. Where he has adapted, or he is someone who can connect the players. And then on top of that, they do have a younger coaching staff as well, or they have a lot of these other people there that get the most out of their players. And it real it really, yeah, because it starts with your core and it goes from there where it starts from your star players, building around them, leaning into them. You look at the Sharks, why is it so successful? Macklin Celebrini, they're just like, all right, you could try to bail us out of every game. And granted, the rest of the roster isn't there yet or isn't there in general, but I mean, they do have some. I should preface, they do have some players that are young players that are good, like Will Smith and William Eklund, and you have those players there. That it's okay. Yeah, you do have some players, but really, it's Celebrini carrying them. I. It's interesting because one of the things that I talked about prospects on top of prospects, and I wonder with that in mind, because I think with some of these teams, you have the great farm system and all that, and I wonder with the right farm system or right development plan, how valuable that is. Because I think it's interesting because there are some teams that haven't necessarily had a great prospect pool, but but because they have a great development plan in place, it helps them out, or because they have a great uh or because they get the most out of their prospects, it ends up working out for them. But how valuable do you think that is?
Well, I am a person who thinks by the time you're drafted, you kind of are what you are. Like your skill sets don't change. However, um, there are just teams that are great at, maximizing those players and teaching them new things. There are coaches that are very good at that. There are teams that are very good at that. And there are teams that are very bad at that. And you see it in their prospect pool, how it ranks year after year. It's not great. So you need that aspect of it as well. You need good scouting, but you also need good development because it does matter, right? Even if, a guy like, for example, a guy like Macklin Celebrini, um, I mean, he's kind of the same player that he was 2 years ago when he was drafted. Even a guy like Sidney Crosby, um, sure, he's a little different, but I mean, from when he was drafted to even now, the skill sets are kind of the same. So you do need a good development staff, but you do need good scouting as well to build up that prospect pool.
Well, it's also worth noting. I think picks after a top five pick, like picks 1 through 5, generally, yeah, they can be on the NHL roster, or the development plan isn't really needed is needed as much for those players. After that, though, a lot of these players they have to go back to junior, or they have to go to college, and I think from there you could see a lot of teams that it's basically where they have what you could call it malpractice with their prospects, where they don't have a plan, or it's all right, we want them on the NHL team for 10 games, but then we'll send them to junior. And where are they in junior? And sometimes they're not on top of these players in junior where they don't really know what's going on, where they are, and all that stuff. And I think what's interesting is because I cover the AHL a lot, is I don't think a good AHL team necessarily helps with a rebuild, but it does help the retool where you can you if you have a good AHL team that has the right culture in place, that allows prospects to take steps forward and not steps back. Those prospects that are there are depth players that can just come in and fill gaps. You look at the Bruins with Providence, what they've done, or the Capitals for years with Hershey. where the Capitals are a good example of a team that retooled, where you have that you have that AHL team that is good, that allows these borderline players, those players that you say, okay, maybe they'll be a depth player in the NHL someday, but they take steps forward and not steps back. And it's interesting because I think that's the interesting part to this as well, is that if you have if you have that those good AHL teams, it really just it saves you that headache. You have a good plan in place. And I wonder, you probably agree with that, or I'm guessing.
Yeah, for sure. Coaching is important there as well. Like you need for you want to look at Hershey. Um, Protas is playing very well there. You have, I mean, you they embrace kind of their young guys. You need a coaching staff at all levels, from junior to AHL. You need to be on the same page with even those management groups and coaching to make sure that your player is being put in the right spot to succeed. And the Capitals are very good at that. So that's why their retool looks somewhat promising, even though they never really bottomed out.
And I think what's interesting, talking about these AHL teams, is that you look what they do, and it's interesting because people say, "Oh, they're not giving their prospects so much time, or they're not necessarily leaning into their prospects." There, I know Protas is actually the exception because he's a 19-year-old rookie and he's their top line center. And the Capitals, actually, the Hershey Bears, have two rookies leading them in points. Andrew Crystal's another guy who's leading them in points. But generally, the model that Hershey runs is we're a veteran heavy team. We're trying to win at this level, and we're going to let our prospects develop, and meanwhile they're going to learn from the older players, where some teams they throw their prospects into the fire. I mean, I don't I'm going to tie this into the Flyers, the Phantoms. When Oliver Bonk came back, his first game back, he's their top defense prospect. They just put him on the top line and top power play. And not to be too harsh to him because he's a good kid, he looked like a deer on the ice, just lost, like just skating around, not knowing where to be. And it's like you're on power play one, and it's like, okay, well, what do I play? He just looked lost. And that's because I think the coaching staff's done a great job there. But when you have this front office up top that's kind of telling you, okay, we need these players to play, and whether they're ready or not, it does lead to malpractice there as well. We're running low on time, so I actually want to ask you, circling back to the teams that are there that are rebuilding now. You look at some of the new teams in this picture, like maybe the Rangers, the Maple Leafs, the Canucks, the Flames. Which one of those teams, that I mentioned all these teams off the top of my head that are kind of new to the party, I guess, new to the rebuild party? Welcome. Which ones are you most confident in that can really turn it around?
I like what Calgary's doing. They already have some pieces in place because, as you mentioned before, they kind of did do some rebuilding-ish moves. They have good pieces in place, like Zane Parekh, Dustin Wolf. Those guys will be in their primes in a few years, and you can kind of build around them and add a franchise level player to them to that group in this draft. So I don't think they have that much work to do, and this draft will help, and the next draft will help. So really, a lot of their work has already been done. Um, as for these other teams, they have to commit to a rebuild, and they have to draft well, and they have to get a core, right? So I think the Flames are a little bit, maybe a step ahead of everyone else.
I actually agree with the Flames here. I want to follow up really quickly, which is, do you feel better about the Flames now than you did a year ago?
It's tough because Dustin Wolf, for example, has taken a step back. I mean, he was a Vezina type candidate last year, but I do feel better about them because they're going to be getting a piece that they very much needed. And next draft as well, they're going to be getting a piece that they very much need. I don't expect them to be very good next year. I mean, maybe they surprise us, but they did trade away a lot of key players off a roster that already wasn't very good. So that's probably two, maybe franchise level players, maybe slightly less than. But again, Wolf and Parekh, and you have some of the other guys that they've drafted recently. I think they have something building there.
It's funny because I asked that question. I agree there, which is, a year ago I actually had the Flames really high on my rebuild rankings because you have the elite goaltender to build around, and very few teams have that. And now you look at their team, and the Flames a few years ago was okay. What's their ceiling when you have Nazem Kadri as your best player or Jonathan Huberdeau as your best player? They still have Huberdeau, so okay, but maybe they got to find a way to trade him too. But Uyghur, you had this core that how far could that take you? And now you're really starting from scratch where you're leaning into that young talent, Perek, Wolf, who's got to bounce back. And if you draft, I don't know, like Gavin McKenna or Ivor Stenberg, one of these elite talents, just add into that team in a few years, all of a sudden they're in the big picture, they're better set up to contend not just for the playoffs, but for a cup, which is I think the big picture what you're looking at. And I think yeah, it's kind of funny because I actually agree with you there on the Flames. I Wow, we went through. We probably could have talked for another hour, especially if I mentioned the Flyers more. But that's all we got, Justin. I really appreciate you hopping on. It's always fun. It's always fun chatting hockey with you. It was always fun having you on. So, Justin, any plugs? Anything you're working on now? Floor is yours. Quick plugs.
Well, over at the Hockey Writers, we are releasing our draft prospect profiles where we scout the guys. Probably, you should probably call it player evaluation because scouting kind of implies you're going to, every single game or every other game, whatever. But either way, we are giving detailed analysis on these players, and there are going to be probably a couple hundred of these. I'm going to try to do as many as I can. Um, so yeah, it's definitely a fun time of year for that aspect because it's fun watching these kids and seeing what they become later to see if we were, right about them.
Yeah, and this is also a fun draft to do your scouting on. I don't know that much about the draft, uh, to know okay, these are the elite players. I know I mentioned McKenna and Stenberg, but yeah, a lot of great prospects. And I think this year people don't know what the top five looks like. They don't know what the top three and maybe even number one. They don't know, but there's a lot of good names to just keep in mind with all that in mind. And to circle it back to the Bruins picking at six, I just can picture Albert Smits landing on their lap at six because they'll get that pick potential if it ends up if the lottery ends up working out the way it does and they get the sixth pick, they just get Albert Smits and then they have uh, James Hagens and Albert Smits to build around for the future with Dan Zlakmelis, another Latvian on their team. Just would be just a way to beat up on another team in their Atlantic Division. But I digress on that. But anyway, yeah, Justin does great work. Justin doing great work at the Hockey Writers. Check it all out. A lot of great stuff there. You can check out my work also at Hockey Hot Stove in the new edition. As you can check out my AHL coverage at the Hockey News. So that's new there. But please comment, share, and subscribe to this YouTube channel, which could do, and that would help a lot. So we hope you enjoyed and tune in next time for another great episode. Thank you.